Although I am an active member of the Church of Satan, I do not speak for the Church of Satan. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 17 of the Undertaking Satan podcast. We have a wonderful interview with Reverend Dr. Dylan Clarke. He is a Satanist. He is a tarot reader. He and his wife, Priestess Sarah Josephine Clarke, run Moon and Sun Emporium, which is a wonderful witchy shop that also facilitates Reverend Dr. Dylan Clarke's tarot readings. It was very informative speaking with such a distinguished gentleman on a plethora of topics, as you'll see. I learned that Priestess Clarke was a very good friend of Joe Netherworld, so it was very interesting to learn of that link between him and the Clarke family. I'd also like to mention that this interview was heavily influenced by what I learned about Dr. Clarke over on the Neutral Wisdom podcast, so I'm going to link that in the description. I think that you should probably listen to that before you listen to this one just to get more background on Dylan himself. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Episode 17, Interview with a Satanic Tarot Reader. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this installment of Undertaking Satan. I'm super excited to have Reverend Dr. Dylan Clarke on this evening to talk about tarot. Little known fact about Grendal, I used to be a tarot reader and had a formal business that I sort of scuttled just because of some difficulties with it. And I really wanted to chop up the idea of tarot in general from a satanic perspective with someone who is actively running a tarot business and just kind of see where the conversation takes us. Reverend Dr. Dylan Clarke, welcome, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I know that a lot of times we ask for people to give sort of the origin story of Satanism, but tonight I kind of want to talk more about you in particular and the tarot side of things. So I would encourage everyone for that information to go on over to the Neutral Wisdom podcast. I'll leave the link down in the description here of this interview as well. With that being said, sir, my first question for you, your background is in mathematics and computers. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's correct.
One of the questions that arose in my mind in the tarot world versus computers and the subconscious and all that stuff, does all that stuff kind of roll together for you? Does that kind of link up in your mind?
Yes, I would say so. There's a lot that, like, my way of thinking about things is influenced both by the computer science background and my backgrounds in things like NLP and obviously tarot itself. Yeah, I'd probably have some degree of a Jungian perspective to it, looking at like archetypal figures in the tarot, and at the same time always trying to, apply logical reasoning through it.
I'm glad you mentioned Jung. My background is in psychology. That's sort of what I did before I was a funeral director. A lot of what I studied and how I got into tarot myself was kind of through that academic psychological side, looking at things like Jungian archetype, more of a neo-Jungian, but Joseph Campbell and the hero quest. Are you familiar with any of that sort of stuff?
Yes.
Is that a big influence for you on tarot as well? I know for me, that's kind of where it really stems from on a psychological, scientific basis.
Yes, I definitely have an interest in that. And one of my mentors, Fran Burgess, I'm not sure this was in the NLP world. I'm not sure whether this originated with her or whether it came from one of her mentors, would work with concepts like crossing the threshold as part of self-development. So actually kind of acting out a crossing the threshold exercise and meeting mentors and things like that.
I had heard in your other interviews that you were, a hypnotist and worked in the NLP world. I actually have as well, which is another odd commonality. I actually learned that during my college time as well as part of my psychological endeavors, if you will. And then also had a little bit of experience on the stage magician side of hypnosis, if that makes sense. NLP, for folks who don't understand, is neuro-linguistic programming. And it's all about this idea of using language in a certain way to pass what's called the critical factor, which is you could sort of envision as the guard who protects the information coming into the conscious to go to the subconscious. You got to kind of lull that guy to sleep or bribe him or something of that nature. My question directly is, have you ever tried to bring someone into trance during a tarot reading? Is that something you've ever experimented with? And I know with NLP, sometimes you can't give away your secrets or they don't work anymore. But has that ever factored into your tarot reading as well?
I always see a good tarot reading as having an element of trance to it, which I think there always is when like two people share a deep experience. But I often explicitly do trance work with people who are open for it in a reading. There's often a small amount of change work at the end of one if it's relevant to that person.
I see. I feel very much the same way. Just recently, last month in January, I did sort of a piece honoring Joe Netherworld, who was a prominent Satanist, Magister Joe Netherworld, who has passed along and is not with us anymore. In that piece, I mentioned that I enjoyed tarot, but I didn't want to confuse the subjects anymore when it comes to Satanism, because as you know, we always have people saying, oh, you practice magic, but you're a Satanist and supposedly an atheist. How does that work? Or, oh, you're supposedly a Satanist, but you say that you don't do any of these evil activities that we hear about. So it's kind of a confused situation. And I always felt being a tarot reader just adds more to that fire. But then I see people like yourself, like Magister Netherworld. I know that Magister Bill M has read cards in the past, Reverend Cardone, and that really gave me kind of the straight and narrow, if you would say, to have the confidence to do it, and also to realize that it does have a place within Satanism as long as it's done correctly. So I wanted to thank you personally. Have you had any issues? Some of the things I ran into, and part of it was I kind of linked it to my everyday persona. So people knew I was a funeral director, and then they would bother me about necromancy specifically, like attempting to use the cards to speak to dead relatives and beyond the veil, that sort of stuff. Have you ever had any issues with that? And if so, how do you handle that sort of thing?
When I've had people talk about anything to do with dead relatives or messages for them, I always try and steer it in a direction of their own impressions. If somebody says, just like to pick an example, what is my dead mother trying to tell me? I will never like explicitly tell them, that's not real, that's not true, because I think, well, first of all, from a purely scientific point of view, I'm 99.9% sure it's not true, but I have no personal experience of being dead. So slightly coming from the hard science is a little bit iffy about telling anybody that anything I can't prove is true. But beyond that, if it's it's their experience, thing I was heavily taught in NLP is to always work in the other person's model of the world. For my own peace of mind, I will try and steer it towards like, sort of, well, the cards suggest that the influence this person had on your life was. That's one good answer, I think, to have they got a message for me? Or I get the feeling that one of the messages that this person had for you during their life was.
I think that's a very good way to handle it, letting the person know that they're actually interacting with the memories of that person themselves. Yes, you're acting as a guide, cards are acting as the guide, but that interaction is solely happening inside of their own mind with their own memories of that person. I think that's probably the best you can do if you choose to enter into a reading like that at all. I wish I was better at that. I kind of leads me to my next topic, which is tarot addiction. I kind of just opened myself up and said, "Hey, world, I'll read tarot with you." And that let in a lot of folks who were mentally unstable, a lot of folks who just have a very unhealthy relationship with divination altogether. I was very much upfront about I'm not a magical guy. I'm, looking at this from a psychological perspective, but still you would get people who just don't believe you, and would just insist that you are somehow magic. Have you had to deal with any of those things with people who just can never have enough?
Not really, no. I mean, some of that may be because most of my readings are either online or at events with predefined start and end times. I've had strange experiences with people, but I do believe that you kind of how you present yourself and where you read and so on brings things in. And ones I've had have been more funny than anything. Like a classic example being somebody at an event who it was an event that also has live music and there's alcohol served there. And he'd obviously been drinking quite a bit, but he wanted a reading and he wasn't, blind drunk. So you could understand. So he wanted to sit down for a reading, and his stated purpose was he wanted to find out if it was real or not, which, is some ways is not that respectful, but I also do see tarot as you're part of the entertainment at an event like that. So fair enough. He wants to spend his money, he wants a reading. We went through a reading that I felt was not one of my better readings, but it was decent. But I was getting hits on things, and I won't say necessarily he found it useful because he wasn't asking for anything useful. He was just wanting to see what I could do as a reader. But he was very impressed. But then his final feedback to me at the end, which I didn't ask for, was you're obviously very, very good at reading tarot and you can really pick things up. But I can tell that English accent is totally fake. And, that's the kind of funny readings I get. Strange, entertaining people.
I see. That's hilarious, by the way.
Another one I would just throw out there without going into any details was a man who'd brought his daughter with him to record his tarot reading. And his opening question was, he has a wife 30 years younger than him. I think his third wife, he said, and she thinks he's a lot richer than he is, and she likes to spend money. Will he be able to stay married to her and basically die before she realizes he doesn't have the money she thinks she's going to inherit? And that with his daughter recording was
Right there. Yeah. Oh, man, it sounds like some funeral arrangements I've had, unfortunately. I think part of kind of the genius of what you do, obviously, your work and your platform is interwoven with Priestess Sarah, Josephine Clarke, and you guys run Moon and Sun Emporium. If they're on a site ran by a Satanist and they are already in the correct mindset, I think that helps a lot. Or if they're, like you said, one of your live events. And I think that's what I failed to do, to tell you the truth. So, lesson learned on that. Do you prefer a certain deck, or are you a Rider-Waite-Smith guy? Do you have any preference on that?
my absolute favorite deck for myself is Tarot of the Cat People by Karen Kuykendall. But I've come to the conclusion that for professional reading, a Rider-Waite or a Rider-Waite variant is what to go for.
That's what I use as well. And I'm very much in the same vein. When I read for myself personally, I use a plethora of, kind of more modern artistic decks. But when you go in for the idea, that authentic feel, if you will, Rider-Waite-Smith is kind of the way to go, because that's what everyone knows. That's what they've seen on the internet. That's what they're familiar with. So
For a time, I was just experimenting with different decks, and at an event, there was a lady, a husband brought her over. He loved getting readings. She'd never had one, and she was very nervous. And that particular event, just because it was what I was playing with at the time, I was inviting people to pick a deck. She was very nervous. I said, "You pick your," and she picked. I forget its name, but it's a very H.P. Lovecraft inspired one, exactly what I wouldn't expect her to go for. And she said, I'd like this deck. And seeing she was already nervous and it had like some quite dark cards in it, I thought, see how this goes. Gave her a read and it worked absolutely fine. At the end, she thanked me and talked about how she'd been scared of readings and how having that deck had made it so much more comfortable for her, because it was the only deck she'd ever seen that had people who weren't white in it. Like she just identified with it more. She felt like, husband was white, so he likes it. All the readers she'd ever seen were white. It's a white people thing. And then she saw a deck, even though it had Lovecraftian monsters in it, it also had a lot of black people and a lot of Arab people in it, and it just immediately made her feel better. And that inspired me to always have a few different decks, because you never know what's going to resonate with the person in front of you.
that is a very good point. Kind of in that vein, do you mix in any oracle cards with your readings? Do you do multiple decks? Do you have any kind of certain style on that?
No, not really. I like Oracle cards, but I've never read them professionally. I just tend to, one deck, I will do a simple spread for somebody, and then part of my style is I always ask them, is there what would you like to explore now? Does this bring anything to mind? Things like that, and go very free form. And a lot of the reading will end up with me pulling either three cards or a single card repeatedly, just in whatever direction the person's mind takes them.
Kind of another one of those nerdy tarot questions, just for folks who don't know about the origins of tarot cards. They're very kind of steeped in mystery, and there's sort of a carnival atmosphere and thought process on trying to make them older than they appear. A lot of folks, think that they go all the way back to Egypt and then were carried over by the Mameluke people to Europe eventually in I believe it was the 1400s. So other people just feel like, well, that's something that originated in Europe and it's something that we use today. They obviously weren't originally used for divination. They were just a fancy card deck like we would have today with another suit, a Trump suit added in. Do you give any credence to the mysticism of sort of that Egyptian history or any of those sort of fantastical origin stories, or do you think if it's more of just a parlor trick that ended up being awesome?
I tend to feel more they were just a deck of cards. Yeah, I wouldn't totally rule out the possibility there wasn't some original symbolism built into them, but it seems unlikely to me. But what I really like is all the mythology and the associations that have built up in them over the years. Even modern horror films and the way that, think about something like a reader in a movie like Warlock or what's it, Lord of Illusions, something like that. Doctor Terror's House of Horror. We've got all these associations, and even if they're not positive, people see tarot as powerful.
And I do think it is powerful. I don't want to poo-poo the idea that there isn't something there, because there often is. Again, when you were over on Neutral Wisdom talking to Rob, you pointed out the fact that if something works, it works. It really doesn't
Yeah.
matter what the specific model or methodology is. We just know that it does work. I will venture to say that my personal belief is it goes back to those Jungian and Campbellian concepts of archetypes. I think it's very possible that the Egyptians had a version of that, because of course they're pulling the same archetypes that would later be pulled on over in Europe in the 1500s. So I tend to think it's a bit of both worlds, to tell you the truth. But I don't believe in the origin story that it's some mystical book of Thoth that was brought over and has now been illuminated to us. I think that's more for if I may borrow a carnival term, mark type of philosophy. But yeah, it's certainly a powerful tool. Another thing that I like that you touched on over on Neutral Wisdom was the idea of, and we've talked about it here a little bit already, especially with that gentleman who sat down and just said, impress me. Yeah, we can do that, but that's what I call a carny reading, with a lot of cold reading and stuff like that. And really, for me, the difference is, in a cold reading or a carny reading, I just don't elaborate. Right. I just pull the cards, say what I'm thinking it means, and it'll generally hit because it's so vague. But I think, and feel free to disagree if you'd like, but the power of a tarot reading is when you actually interact with your tarot reader and ask questions about what the tarot reader is giving you. So then it can be expounded upon. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but was that kind of similar to your thoughts on the process?
Yes, I always like to interact with the person as much as possible. I do feel to some degree, like I don't often think in terms of cold reading, but I'm familiar with the techniques. But for me, it's more just consciously I'm interpreting the cards and my subconscious mind is doing whatever's needed. But I'll find that even if a person doesn't give me much feedback with the right frame, they're often interpreting it all in their own head and interacting with it. I've had a number of clients who've given me very little back, and then either at the end or when I've encountered them later, they'll tell me that it was really useful to them, and basically tell me how they interacted with it, even though they didn't out loud interact with it.
I see. Very interesting how the subconscious mind works and how it tends to link up between humans just with this little common thread with that card in front of us. It's I think it's really worth it for people who are into that stuff, and you can't go whole hog into the spiritual aspects, which is unfortunately the New Age movement is rife with that. Another kind of follow up question: do you intermingle astrology in with your readings at all?
I don't, but I do find astrology fascinating. And Sarah is an incredibly good astrologer.
I think that I really would love to collaborate with you guys on it, but and again, not putting words in your mouth. I believe astrology works, but from a psychological standpoint, I think it has a lot more to do with labeling theory. Very similar to Anton LaVey's synthesizer clock in The Complete Witch. I know that's kind of an apple and oranges comparison, but I will explain. If someone is going after a Scorpio for a romantic endeavor, let's say, and they have a plan on how they're going to interact with this person because they're a Scorpio, that's better than no plan at all. And it gives
Yeah.
them the confidence to do so. I don't want to pretend that I knew what Dr. LeVay was doing when he came up with the synthesizer clock, but knowing that he was a showman and a carnival gentleman and very adverse in psychology himself, I see a lot of that in there. The idea that if you have this model, you're more likely to interact and come up with an actual plan in reality here on the physical coil instead of just thinking about it. What are your thoughts kind of on astrology? Do they echo that? Any different?
I also think, especially on like your very basic star sign astrology, it would make perfect sense to me that basically when your astrological sign comes from when you were born in the year, and when you were born in the year has quite an influence on what the climate and the sunlight levels and maybe even the seasonal foods were over the time that your mother was pregnant and over the time that you were very young and first growing. So I could see an influence from that as well, that it just, your astrological sign to a degree determines some of the conditions of your early childhood and your pre-birth nutrition and sunlight levels.
That's very, I had never really thought about that angle, but that certainly could be the case. There's probably, like most things that survive the test of time, I'm sure it's multifaceted. My partner, Lady Grendal, she's also very heavy into astrology and is very good at it. But we differ on how it works. Let's put it that way. Um, but yeah, and as far as tarot reading is concerned, I also do not like mixing it in, to tell you the truth. Although it does make people feel special when you do. But I think that it's sort of an apples and oranges type of thing when it comes to the specific models of what makes each work. But yeah, I'd love to talk to you guys more about that. It's one of my pet projects, if you will. Could you kind of illuminate us on what you and Priestess Clarke are up to and all the places we could find you and anything new?
The absolute best place to find us is moonandsunemporium.com, which I'm sure will be linked with the episode. You've got
Oh,
Sarah's perfumery there. You've got her art, prints, sculptures, all sorts of beautiful things there. Mostly things she makes herself, occasionally wonderful curated items that she finds, and they're so good that we want some and we make them available to other people. My online tarot readings there. Say that is really the main way to keep up with what we're doing.
awesome. And it is a really cool shop. I like going on there every once in a while. I saw that Priestess Clarke just achieved a certification for her perfume making skills. Happened to see that today before we jumped on earlier in the day. So congratulations to her. And yeah, I'm sure that that's really potent stuff on a lot of levels.
Yeah, perfumery to me has huge overlap with magic. Just it's engaging another of your senses. It's becoming more sensitive, and Sarah's perfumery is something that just really enhances my life. With us both working from home as well, to be able to, go on a break and just smell perfumery ingredients or something that she's working on now. It's another part of living a wonderful life.
Gotcha. Well, kind of the last thing that I wanted to do, sir, and sort of a new thing I'm adding on, and it does go with the sort of funeral aspect of my channel. I think that as Satanists, obviously, the one thing that I get pegged with and I hate is the idea that we're some sort of death worshiping cult. And my message is that in the death industry and as a Satanist, my idea is I want to get people to think about their death so they can move that past and fulfill their life because that's what's important, obviously. But have you given any thought to what your services would look like, if any? Have you ever given a thought to what that process would look like for yourself?
To be honest, I haven't. I tend to be more the sort of person who thinks, well, other than my close family and what I want for them after my death, like, well, when I die, it ends.
Yeah, I find that to be a very common theme among Satanists. And just for my own personal knowledge, I'm actually going to put a poll in the Facebook group. Have you ever thought about burial versus cremation?
I tend more towards cremation, but that's more just because, well, among other things, Sarah likes the idea of cremation more than burial. I know that if I go first, she'll be dealing with what happened to me more than I will be.
Good point. Good point. Well, Reverend Dr. Clarke, thank you so much for coming on tonight. You do have any other anecdotal stories or anything else you'd like to share with us before we close up the episode?
One thing I was going to throw out there, just with you mentioning about the new age culture around tarot, something that I really like from that is, and I'll preface this by saying, if you look at older books about tarot, and I'm thinking like anything before about maybe 1980, there's always a section for professional readers on how to explain the death card to clients so they don't get scared. Whenever I draw the death card, and this is the influence I would say of New Age culture, somebody will also say, now I know that doesn't mean a death. Like they've just nicely made it so we don't have to explain that the death card isn't just about death. Unfortunately, still you now get the horrified reaction with the tower. Oh, tower, that means terrible destruction. And I've always loved the tower as a card. Because to me, like, the tower, like, it's not the idea of something falling down. Something can be falling down to get out of the way for something new. Two things I think are like Sarah will sometimes talk about the value of blowing up your life if you're stuck. One of my NLP mentors, Bill O'Hanlon, would say things like, well, if nothing else will work, you could always have a nervous breakdown. It's worked for me a few times. Not entirely serious, but just this idea that, the destruction of something isn't a bad thing. Yeah, if it's the destruction of your business, that might be a problem if it's the destruction of your health. But if it's the destruction of, an old building that you're knocking down to build a beautiful new house on, that's a great thing.
And not to steal another story from Neutral Wisdom, but that kind of exact thought was in my head. It's kind of giving me goosebumps a little bit, to tell you the truth. But in hearing your story about how you moved over from England to be with Sarah, I'm sure that was a tower-like moment in your life. And then also, I was listening to an interview with Storm and Renee Anderson, and how they relocated to Poughkeepsie after quite literally their house almost fell down after an earthquake. So I'm sure that was a tower moment for them, but wonderful things came out of those tower moments. So yeah, I think you put that wonderfully.
Yeah, you can certainly see how decisions like that can either be catastrophe or a great thing, depending on the people that are involved.
I recently saw it was a meme or whatever saying that everything's perspective. And when the Titanic went down, the lobsters in the kitchen were very happy to be free. So
Yeah.
yeah, one man's tower is another man's miracle, I would guess.
Yeah, there was a boxer, and I don't remember his name, but he was a champion boxer, and he wanted a ticket on the Titanic, and he supposedly was denied one because of racism. And at the time, he was really miserable. He wasn't going to get to go on the first voyage of the Titanic.
Exactly. Sometimes those horrible things save your life in an odd way.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate this. I really, as I said, I've not really failed in tarot, but I've kind of put it way on the back burner. And just this month, with the anniversary of the passing of Magister Netherworld, and then being in contact with yourself and Sarah, and having the chance to talk to someone who's actively a Satanist and a tarot reader has really invigorated me. And I think that I might actually throw a little bit of effort in that direction. So thank you to yourself. Please extend my thanks to Sarah and everything that she's doing over there. I'd love to have you guys on as a couple sometime. I really just think that it's super fun you guys are a super fun satanic couple, if I might say. So, yeah. Well, I think that's going to wrap this one up. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to have all the links in the description down below for everything that we've mentioned during this interview. One more time, thank you, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye now.